Professor Mearsheimer, always great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure to be here, Glenn.
As usual, there is a lot to talk about in the world of foreign policy and militarism and war. We have a new administration that is now inaugurated, the first time we're speaking to you, I believe, since the election, certainly since the inauguration itself. And I want to start with the place we usually start, which is the Middle East, and the most important event clearly seems to be this ceasefire deal that the Israelis and Gazans, the Palestinians, were able to reach, by all reports, due in large part, if not overwhelmingly, due to the efforts of Donald Trump and his envoy. What do you make of this, the timing of this ceasefire? Why, after 15 months of never really getting close, was this agreement entered into now?
Well, I think the key factor here, this is not to take anything away from what Trump did, but the key factor is that the IDF, the Israeli military, is in deep trouble.
The situation in Gaza has spiraled into chaos, exposing some harsh truths about the state of the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF. For years, the IDF was structured to fight short, decisive wars, quick, brutal, and with minimum distortions to their societal and military infrastructure. But in Gaza, this strategy has hit a wall. 15 months of prolonged conflict, the cracks are starting to show. Morale is low, reservists are stretched thin, and reports suggest that Hamas has inflicted significant damage with rudimentary but effective tactics like unexploded ordnance. The ceasefire conveniently aligns with Trump's inauguration, it feels. Also, more like a political pause than a path to peace. With only a 6-week window, with no clear plan of stage 2, is Israel stalling for time to regroup perhaps? Or is this a sign for deeper issues within the strategy? And what happens when the ceasefire ends? Let's dive in.
It's an army that was configured to fight short wars, not long wars. It's heavily dependent on reservists, and it was having a really difficult time in Gaza. Furthermore, it's quite clear, and this is certainly true if you look at the actual ceasefire agreement, that the Israelis have not been able to defeat Hamas. So it's not like if they had stayed there for another week or another month or another couple months, they would have defeated Hamas. They couldn't defeat Hamas, and the military was coming apart at the seams. So that gave the IDF very powerful incentives to push Netanyahu to agree to the deal. And that, combined with the pressure from Trump, did the trick.
The concern that a lot of people have who want there finally to be peace in Gaza is the fact that this deal is structured in multiple stages, the first of which is just a 6-week ceasefire where they exchange some hostages, each side does, and the Israelis are supposed to withdraw gradually from Gaza. And Netanyahu has been openly saying, as have U.S. officials and lots of other people in Israel, that they have no intention of proceeding to stage 2, where the ceasefire would become something more akin to a peace deal, something more permanent, that they just want to get some hostages back, and then they absolutely intend to resume bombing and destroying Gaza based on whatever pretext they create about how Hamas is violating the deal. Now, based on what you just said, which is that part of the reason they agreed to it in the first place was because their military just needs a respite. They're not really succeeding. They have been succeeding in killing a lot of IDF soldiers with primitive explosive devices from unexploded ordnance and the like. That would suggest that that's just something Netanyahu is saying to assuage whatever right-wing opposition he has to the deal. Oh, don't worry, we're going to get our hostages back, and then we're going to go back and kill more Palestinians. Is your expectation then that this will in fact proceed to stage 2 and become, if not permanent, something longer term than that 6 weeks?
I don't know for sure, Glenn, but I would say two things. Number one, there are about 98 hostages that are supposed to be exchanged, a number of whom are dead, by the way. And in the first phase, 33 hostages are returned to the Israelis. That means that 65 are scheduled to come in the second phase. And that means that if there is no second phase, 65 hostages remain in the hands of Hamas. The second point I would make to you is that the Israelis talk about restarting the war in Gaza. What exactly are they going to do? There's hardly anything left to bomb. Are they going to make the rubble bounce? And in terms of defeating Hamas, after 14 months, they've been unable to defeat Hamas. By accounts in the Israeli media, Hamas is alive and well. And there is no expectation that it's going to collapse anytime soon. So if they go back to war, do they have a formula for defeating Hamas? I think the answer is no. So the incentives for the Israelis to restart this war are just not very powerful.
Here's something I genuinely don't understand. I have talked to a lot of people since the outbreak of this war, including with you, that there's an obvious lesson that the United States supposedly learned from having prosecuted this war on terror in many different countries over many years, killing a huge number of civilians, ostensibly in the name of destroying terrorism or eliminating al-Qaeda or extremism, which was that, as it turns out, when you go around the world in specific countries and you bomb people and you kill civilians, and people in those countries see the images every night of children blown up and wedding parties droned and, entire cities in rubble, it unsurprisingly creates the motivation for other people who previously weren't linked to extremism to want to join out of anger and rage that as human beings we would all have if our societies were being attacked that way. Even Secretary of State Blinken, or former, at this point, Secretary of State Blinken, said shortly before leaving office that it seems like Hamas has been able to recruit at least as many people as the Israelis killed, if not more. And this is incredibly predictable. You and I have talked about this. Everybody has talked about this. We've seen the lessons from the war on terror. So is it really just that the Israelis just think that they were capable of doing something that we've seen over and over fails? Or was there something else going on in terms of their real motive? That's always the question I come back to, because who doesn't know that unless you kill every last Palestinian, the ones that you leave are going to be ones that hate Israel and are going to want to get vengeance for what was just done to their society?
I think the answer to your question, Glenn, is that the Israelis were not mainly interested in destroying Hamas. They were interested in ethnically cleansing Gaza. They were interested in driving all of the Palestinians out of Gaza. And that, in effect, would solve the Hamas problem, and it would also solve the apartheid problem. I mean, as you and I know, Israel is an apartheid state, and that is a huge problem for the Israelis. They know what happened to South Africa, so they'd like to put an end to that status as an apartheid state, and ethnically cleansing does that, and it solves the Hamas problem, and that was the goal. It didn't work, and of course, it morphed into a genocide in the process.
So I guess then that is the question, is you have Gaza, and as you said, there's basically nothing left to bomb. We've seen the drone footage now of places in northern Gaza, in southern Gaza, in Rafah, where Biden said it was a red line for him that the Israelis not attack. And then once they did, to save face, he said, oh, it's just a very limited pinpoint attack inside that refugee camp. And you look at it and the entire thing has been flattened and carpet bombed. And clearly, Hamas is still there. They're still the governing body. And they have not succeeded in driving the Palestinians out of Gaza. So the question then becomes, what is going to happen to Gaza if those people remain, those 2+ million people, and presumably they will, at some point, it's going to have to be rebuilt. What do you think the Israelis expect in terms of post-war Gaza that it would be like, and what do you think it will be like?
Well, to put it in slightly different terms, the Israeli goal here was to make Gaza unlivable. And if you make Gaza unlivable, then presumably the Palestinians have no choice but to leave. They've failed in that regard. And what has to be done now is that Gaza has to be made livable. And of course, you see lots of trucks with food, water, oil, and medicine coming in now. And that will help in the short term make Gaza livable. The question is what happens over the long term? And a lot depends not only on what the Netanyahu government plans to do, but what the American government plans to do. And who knows? I mean, the fact is that Hamas is still in control. You remember the IDF, this is the IDF and the Biden administration were begging Netanyahu to tell them what his plan was for once the war started, or once the war stopped. In other words, the IDF and the Biden administration wanted to know how Gaza was going to be administered. He refused to give an answer. And the reason is he was planning to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. So he thought this would be a moot point. That didn't happen. But there's no plan in place. And at the same time, Hamas is in charge. And that means that if you rebuild Gaza, you'll be rebuilding it with Hamas in place. How that happens, very hard to see. So it's a giant question mark moving forward.
Drone and satellite images show a haunting story. Entire neighborhoods flattened, rubble piled high where families once lived, and now left with bodies under deep rubble. The IDF's true intention becomes impossible to ignore. As Professor John Mearsheimer pointed out, Israel's goal was never about defeating Hamas. This war was about making Gaza unlivable, forcing Palestinians out to abandon their homes, their land, their identity, ethnic cleansing by design, morphing into genocide by consequences. And it feels as if their job has been done, but what's left? Perhaps West Bank? But here's the hypocrisy. While Israel claims to defend itself, it's obliterating an entire population under the guise of security. They bomb refugee camps, destroy infrastructure, and when questioned, shift blame to Hamas. What's left to bomb now? The rubble itself? Even Secretary Blinken admitted Hamas recruits faster than Israel can kill. Yet the cycle of violence continues. Aid trucks might trickle in, but that's a band-aid and a wound that Israel inflicted. What happens next? Does Gaza get rebuilt only to be destroyed again? What role will the U.S. play? Another blank check to Netanyahu's government, or genuine pressure for peace? The double standards are glaring. Israel decrees terrorism, yet engages in state-sponsored terror. It condemns human rights abuses abroad while perpetrating apartheid at home. The world is watching, but will it act? Or will Gaza remain a graveyard of unfulfilled promises and broken lives? The answers lie in what we demand from our leaders. This isn't about Gaza or Hamas. It's about human dignity, justice, and holding those in power accountable. Let's hope the world doesn't look away again. These double standards can't be ignored. On Zees Political Arrow, we uncover the truth and ask the hard questions others won't. Will justice ever find Gaza? Stick around. If you enjoyed this video, please share, like, and subscribe. And until then, let's expose the truth together.